What drives a king to walk calmly toward his own execution, convinced until his final breath that he was right and his subjects wrong? On a frozen January morning in 1649, a monarch climbed the scaffold steps with such dignity that even his executioners hesitated. This was Charles I of England, a man whose stubborn belief in his divine right to rule would tear a nation apart, drench three kingdoms in blood, and end with an axe falling on a royal neck. How does a prince raised in silk and ceremony become the only English king ever executed by his own people? Born in November 1600 in Dunfermline Palace, Scotland, Charles entered the world as a weak and sickly child, never expected to wear a crown. His older brother Henry was everything a future king should be. Strong, charismatic, beloved, Charles could barely walk or speak clearly as a toddler, overshadowed in every way, but fate, as it often does, had other plans. When Prince Henry died suddenly of typhoid fever in 1612, the frail younger brother became heir to three kingdoms: England, Scotland, and Ireland. Can you imagine the weight thrust upon shoulders so unprepared? When his father, King James I, died in 1625, 24-year-old Charles inherited a throne sitting atop a powder keg. England's parliament was growing restless, jealously guarding its power over taxation. Charles, however, had absorbed his father's teachings completely. Kings ruled by God's will alone, answerable to heaven, not to assemblies of common men. Within months of his coronation, he married Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, scandalizing his Protestant subjects. Was this love or political calculation? Either way, the marriage cemented Parliament's suspicions that their new king might secretly sympathize with Catholic powers abroad. The first clash came swiftly. Parliament refused to grant Charles the customs revenues traditionally given to monarchs, wanting to control the purse strings and limit his power. Outraged, Charles dissolved Parliament in 1626, then again in 1629, each time convinced they were overstepping their bounds. For the next 11 years, he ruled without calling Parliament at all, a period remembered as the personal rule, or more ominously, the 11 Years' Tyranny. How did he fund his government without Parliament's taxes? Through increasingly creative and unpopular means. Reviving ancient feudal dues, expanding ship money, a naval tax traditionally levied only on coastal towns, to the entire nation. Every demand felt like tyranny to subjects who believed in their rights as freeborn Englishmen. But Charles's most catastrophic error was attempting to impose English-style church governance on Scotland. The Scots had their Presbyterian kirk, and they cherished it fiercely. When Charles tried to force the English Book of Common Prayer upon Scottish churches in 1637, rebellion exploded. Legend says a woman named Jenny Geddes hurled her stool at the dean during the first reading, shouting, "Devil cause thee colic in thy stomach, false thief. Darest thou say mass at my ear?" True or embellished, the sentiment was real. Scotland rose in armed resistance, and Charles, lacking the funds to field a proper army, was forced to recall the English Parliament in 1640 after 11 years of silence. Could he have known this decision would seal his fate? The Parliament that assembled in November 1640, later known as the Long Parliament, had no intention of meekly granting Charles his war funds. Years of resentment poured forth. They arrested and later executed his closest advisor, the Earl of Strafford, despite Charles's promise of protection. They abolished the hated ship money. They passed laws preventing the king from dissolving Parliament without its consent. Charles watched his absolute power crumble, piece by piece, and his Stuart pride burned with humiliation. Then came a crisis that would push tensions past the breaking point. In October 1641, Catholic Ireland erupted in rebellion, and thousands of Protestant settlers were massacred. Parliament prepared to raise an army, but who would control it? Could they trust such power in the hands of a king they increasingly suspected of Catholic sympathies? In January 1642, Charles made a decision that shattered any remaining trust. He personally led armed soldiers into the House of Commons to arrest 5 members of Parliament he considered traitors. It was an unprecedented violation, and it failed spectacularly. The 5 MPs had been warned and escaped by boat down the Thames. The king stood in the Speaker's chair and famously declared, "I see all the birds are flown," but the damage was done. A king had brought weapons into Parliament itself. Within months, both sides were raising armies. England stumbled into civil war, a conflict that would consume the nation for the next 7 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The English Civil War pitted royalists, called Cavaliers for their aristocratic Cavalier style, against parliamentarians, nicknamed Roundheads for their close-cropped Puritan haircuts. At first, Charles's forces held advantages. Experienced officers, cavalry superiority, control of the north and west. But Parliament controlled London, the Navy, and England's wealthiest regions. More importantly, they found a military genius in Oliver Cromwell, a country gentleman who forged the new model army, a disciplined, ideologically driven fighting force unlike anything England had seen. Battle after battle, Cromwell's Ironsides proved unstoppable. The decisive defeat came at Naseby in June 1645, where the royalist army was shattered. Charles fled north, his cause collapsing around him. What do you do when you've lost the war but refuse to admit defeat? Charles spent the next 3 years in a desperate dance of negotiation and betrayal. He surrendered to the Scots, hoping they'd support him against the English Parliament. They sold him to Parliament for £400,000. He escaped to the Isle of Wight, where he secretly negotiated with different factions, playing them against each other. He even made a deal with the Scots for a second invasion, sparking a brief, bloody Second Civil War in 1648. But this final gamble backfired catastrophically. To Parliament's leaders, especially the army, Charles was now a man of blood, someone whose treachery had caused unnecessary death and suffering. The time for negotiation was over. In December 1648, Parliament was purged of any members sympathetic to the king in what became known as Pride's Purge. The remaining rump Parliament established a high court of justice to try Charles for high treason. Think about the audacity, trying a king, someone who claimed to be God's anointed representative on earth, as a common criminal. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority, declining to enter a plea. "I would know by what power I am called hither," he demanded. "I would know by what authority I mean lawful." But his protests fell on determined ears. The court had already decided his fate. On January 27, 1649, Charles Stuart was found guilty and sentenced to death. On the morning of January 30, 1649, Charles walked from St. James's Palace to Whitehall. It was bitterly cold, and he wore 2 shirts so he wouldn't shiver and appear afraid. He had spent the previous days in prayer and preparation, convinced he was a martyr for the divine right of monarchy. On the scaffold, erected outside the banqueting house where he had once danced at masques, Charles addressed the small crowd permitted near. He forgave his enemies but maintained his innocence. "I am the martyr of the people," he declared, meaning he died for defending the proper order of kingship. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he placed his head on the block. With a single stroke, the axe fell and a gasp rose from the crowd. Some rushed forward to dip handkerchiefs in the royal blood, believing it held sacred power. England had killed its king. The execution shocked Europe. Monarchs across the continent watched in horror as one of their own was publicly killed by his subjects. Scotland immediately proclaimed Charles's exiled son as Charles II. But England became a commonwealth, a republic led by Parliament and increasingly by Oliver Cromwell's military authority. For 11 years, England experimented with government without a king, though Cromwell himself would eventually be offered the crown and refuse it, ruling as Lord Protector instead. The Republican experiment, however, did not survive Cromwell's death. By 1660, exhausted by political instability, England invited Charles II back from exile. The monarchy was restored, though forever changed. Never again would an English monarch claim absolute divine right with the same confidence. Charles I's legacy is deeply contested. To some, he was a tyrant who trampled on English liberties and provoked unnecessary bloodshed through his stubborn pride. To others, especially within the Anglican Church, he was a martyr who died defending the sacred principle of monarchy and the true faith. The Church of England even commemorates him as a saint on January 30th. What's undeniable is that his reign forever altered the relationship between Crown and Parliament. His execution demonstrated that kings were not untouchable, that sovereignty ultimately resided in the people or their representatives. The English Civil War became a reference point for later revolutions, including the American and French upheavals more than a century later. When Americans declared independence, they were, in part, echoing arguments first made by 17th-century parliamentarians against Charles. Today, when we debate the limits of executive power, the balance between authority and liberty, or the right of people to resist unjust rulers, we're still grappling with questions that Charles I's reign brought to a bloody climax. His story reminds us that power unchecked by accountability inevitably leads to conflict, that principle without pragmatism can destroy as surely as tyranny, and that sometimes the greatest threats to stability come not from revolutionaries but from rulers who cannot adapt. Charles believed he was defending eternal truths. His opponents believed they were protecting English freedom. Both were so convinced of their righteousness that compromise became impossible and a nation paid the price in blood. The man who walked so calmly to the scaffold, convinced of his divine mandate until the final moment, teaches us something profound about the dangers of absolute certainty. Charles I was not a monster. By most accounts, he was cultured, pious, devoted to his family, and genuinely believed he was serving God and country. Yet his inability to recognize the legitimacy of opposing views, his conviction that any limitation on his power was an offense against divine order, led directly to catastrophe. History is full of such tragedies, good people firm in their righteousness, unable to see that their certainty is leading them and others toward disaster. The king who lost his head lost it in the end because he could never imagine he might be wrong. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more. See you in the next one.